Story 1. The narrator, a 38-year-old man living in the wilderness of northern Canada, begins his story by recalling an experience he will never forget. 2 years ago, when he was living alone in a large log cabin with only a few other houses nearby, he never imagined that the hunting trip he planned with his younger brother would turn into a strange and haunting story. Although he was a seasoned wilderness ranger, he realized that there were dangers not from nature but from humans. To prepare for the trip, he and his younger brother planned to go hunting in late fall. It felt like a last vacation of the year before winter set in. However, he knew that on long trips like this, careful preparation was essential. He informed his neighbors of his plans, a habit he had always maintained to ensure the safety of his home while he was away. This was something he always did when he was away, since sudden snowstorms could ruin any plans. As he drove north on the narrow road, it began to snow. At first, it was just a light layer, nothing unusual. But after a few minutes, the snow became thick and thick, covering the road, reducing visibility and making it difficult to drive. He realized that his truck, although a fairly new and reliable one, could not handle the heavy snow as it slid off the road. In that moment, he knew things would not be easy. There was no cell service, no one to help, and the road was sparsely traveled. After trying unsuccessfully to free his car from the snow for a while, he decided to walk to his brother's house, despite the long and deserted road. Armed with a hunting rifle and a shotgun, he continued his journey, while it gradually became dark and the temperature dropped. The snow was falling harder, and as he rounded a bend, he suddenly discovered a large tree felled across the road. What was strange was that the cut on the tree was very clean, as if it had been chopped with a machete or a chainsaw. He felt a chill run down his spine, his mind starting to speculate. Was this a trap or a deliberate attack? Concerned, he continued towards the fallen tree, only to realize that there were two men standing nearby. They looked at him with challenging eyes and asked him to help move the tree. But the feeling of unease grew when he realized that there were no cars passing by. What were they doing here? Why didn't anyone help them and just wait for strangers to pass by? These thoughts quickly invaded his mind. He decided to speed up, not responding to their calls, and the calls gradually disappeared into the blinding snow. When he finally reached his brother's house and reported the incident to the police, he realized that things were worse than he thought. His car was not only looted, but completely destroyed. The windows were broken, and everything in the car was taken. The police also confirmed that the incident could be an organized robbery, where the crooks had prepared in advance, hiding in the woods and watching the victim. It was fortunate that he decided to walk instead of waiting for help from those strangers. During his years living in the wild, he had faced dangers from nature many times. But this time he realized that sometimes the greatest danger does not come from nature but from humans who have planned in advance, watching and waiting for unfortunate victims like him to strike. Story 2. Unsettling walk in the woods. The woods had always held an unsettling, almost mystical quality for the narrator, a feeling that stretched back to his childhood days. Growing up in a small, rural town, the woods were more than just a natural backdrop to everyday life. They were a place shrouded in eerie legends and whispers of things better left unexplored. He vividly remembers the feeling of walking along those narrow, shadowy trails as a young boy, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. There was something about those woods that never quite felt right. As a child, the narrator had always been told by his older brother that the woods were haunted by spirits, phantoms who roamed the trees, watching from the shadows. The legend spoke of ancient spirits who were restless, forever wandering, and forever seeking vengeance for forgotten wrongs. The young narrator, already a nervous and anxious child, couldn't help but feel that their presence was real. His heart would race as he walked those paths, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The distant calls of owls or the rustle of leaves in the wind only deepened his sense of dread. But it wasn't just the ghosts that caused the narrator's discomfort. It was the older kids who would often hang around the woods at night. These teenagers, bold and cruel, had a habit of lurking behind trees and scaring the younger children, demanding money or their belongings. Sometimes they would mockingly ask if the kids believed in the spirits of the woods. The intimidation was psychological, but very real. They were known to demand anything of value from the younger kids, money, snacks, or even their phones, using the fear of the forest as leverage. The narrator had been a victim of this bullying a few times. The older kids had cornered him on the path to school, their faces smirking beneath hoods, their eyes gleaming with malice. On one occasion, they stole his lunch money, laughing as they disappeared into the underbrush, disappearing like shadows into the very woods that haunted his imagination. These encounters only served to reinforce his belief that there was something sinister about the woods, that no one was truly safe, not even in broad daylight. Even as an adult, these memories lingered in the back of his mind. The sense of foreboding was something that stayed with him, even though he had learned to ignore it over the years. Still, when he had to walk through the woods, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was always watching. Years later, as an adult, the narrator found himself returning to his hometown, this time to visit his aging mother. Despite his years away, he couldn't escape the strange allure and discomfort the woods still held. On this particular day, the snow was falling heavily, and he decided to take his mother's elderly neighbor's dog for a walk, hoping the fresh air would do them both some good. The woods, covered in snow, had an almost serene beauty, silent and still, save for the crunch of snow underfoot. It was during this walk that the eerie sense of unease, long buried in his childhood, resurfaced. He was about halfway down the path when he heard a distant scream. His first instinct was to brush it off as children playing, perhaps some local kids engaging in snowball fights or making mischief. But as he continued down the trail, something didn't sit right. The wind picked up, and the quiet of the woods seemed to deepen, as if holding its breath. He heard footsteps behind him, soft at first, but getting louder. Someone was walking the same path, but at a pace much quicker than his. Instinctively, the narrator pulled the dog off the trail and into the trees. The dog hesitated but followed his lead. Hiding among the thick underbrush, he peered cautiously through the branches. A man emerged from the fog of snow, a tall figure wearing a black beanie and a brown jacket, his head darting nervously from side to side. His hands were clenched into fists, as if ready for a fight. The man's hurried pace only added to the unease in the air. He wasn't just walking, he was running from something. The narrator couldn't shake the feeling that he was in danger. It wasn't just the man's frantic movements. There was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. He was too tense, too aware of his surroundings. The man's eyes darted around as though he was worried someone might be following him, but he didn't seem to notice the narrator or the dog, hidden just a few feet away. The dog, thankfully, remained still and quiet, sensing the tension but keeping calm. The narrator's heart raced, and his mind scrambled for answers. Who was this man? And why did he seem so desperate to escape? The man passed by, not noticing the pair in the bushes, and the narrator held his breath until he was sure he was gone. Only then did he slowly re-emerge from his hiding spot, taking a few cautious steps back onto the trail. But it wasn't until the next day, when he saw a report on the local news, that the gravity of the situation truly hit him. The police were searching for a man who had stabbed 2 women on a nearby deserted path the night before. The suspect was described as tall, wearing a dark jacket and a black beanie, just like the man he had seen in the woods. The narrator's blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. He had unknowingly crossed paths with a fugitive, a murderer. He couldn't help but think of how close he had come to becoming part of that grim story. Had he not followed his gut instinct to hide, he might have been caught in a far more dangerous situation. The realization that he had walked right past someone capable of such violence made him shiver, even though the temperature had dropped significantly that day. In that moment, he understood that the woods were far more dangerous than he had ever imagined, not just because of the ghosts or spirits his brother had warned him about as a child, but because of the very real threats that sometimes hid in the shadows. This encounter was a stark reminder that danger could come from unexpected places. It wasn't just the wilderness that was to be feared, but the people who chose to hide within it, lurking behind trees and in the quiet of the snow, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And it was his quick thinking and the presence of mind to hide that had likely saved him from becoming the next victim of a crime that would haunt the town for years to come. Story 3. Parents' Camping Experience. The narrator's parents, though living in the safety of a small, tightly knit community, had always shared stories of their youthful adventures in the great outdoors. One particular story from their early days together always stood out to him: their camping trip in the Upper Peninsula, where they had a terrifying encounter with a massive bear. At the time, the narrator's parents were dating and decided to take a break from the comforts of cabin life and go real camping, as his father liked to call it. His mother, always a little more cautious, preferred the safety of the cabins, but eventually agreed to camp near a lake, away from the well-worn paths that tourists usually took. They were not far from the cabins, but far enough to feel the rawness of nature's embrace. The day had been perfect, a pristine lake surrounded by dense trees, the sounds of birdsong filling the air. The couple spent the day swimming in the lake, enjoying each other's company, and taking in the beauty of the untouched wilderness. They set up their tent in a secluded area, just off the trail, nestled near the edge of the forest where the sound of water gently lapping against the shore added to the peacefulness of the moment. As the evening drew in, the mood shifted. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the once serene forest grew dark and heavy with the scent of pine. After a quiet dinner by the fire, they retired to the safety of their tent, their laughter and light-hearted conversation the only sounds to break the silence. But that silence wouldn't last long. In the dead of night, while they were lying in their tent, the first sign of danger appeared. It was subtle at first, just a faint rustling outside. The narrator's mother, who was always more sensitive to the sounds of the wild, immediately went still, her eyes widening as she motioned for his father to be quiet. Then they heard it. Heavy footsteps, moving closer, the unmistakable sound of something large and powerful trudging through the underbrush. It wasn't long before they saw the cause of the noise. A massive bear emerged from the darkness, its silhouette only visible in the faint light from the dying campfire. The bear wasn't aggressive at first. It simply roamed, its enormous frame lumbering through the woods. But when it saw the camp, it stopped and stared. The couple held their breath, watching the bear from the safety of the tent, unsure of what to do. They had read the warnings. Bears were curious creatures, but they weren't usually interested in humans. Still, their hearts raced, and every instinct told them to stay still, to avoid drawing attention. The bear, however, wasn't done. It began to circle their tent, sniffing the air, its massive nose pressing against the fabric. The sound of its heavy breathing filled the air, making the couple's skin prickle with anxiety. Suddenly, the bear did something that made their blood run cold. It began to test the tent. With a powerful swipe of its massive paw, it struck the side of the tent, the force causing the entire structure to collapse inward. The fabric buckled under the pressure, the sound of tearing and stretching filling the air. The narrator's father described it as if the bear was trying to figure out what the tent was, as though it was testing it, seeing if it could break through. The couple stayed utterly silent, barely able to breathe, knowing that if the bear decided to push further, their thin fabric tent would offer no protection. For what seemed like an eternity, The bear sniffed around the base of the tent, its large paw pressing against the fabric again and again, as if it were testing the strength of the material. The couple could feel the heat of its breath on the tent, and the bear's grumbling growls sent chills down their spines. Eventually, the bear seemed to lose interest, its paw retracting from the tent. It shuffled around for a few more moments, sniffing at the ground and circling the campsite. After what felt like hours, the bear finally wandered off into the darkness of the forest. The couple didn't dare move until they were sure it was gone. The next morning, they packed up in haste and left the campsite at first light, eager to escape the unease that hung in the air. The father later told the narrator that they had been incredibly lucky. If the bear had been in a more aggressive mood, it could have easily ripped through the tent with its claws and torn them apart. The fact that it had merely tested the tent before leaving was a blessing. But for the parents, the experience had left an indelible mark. It wasn't the first time they had camped in the wild, but it was the most harrowing. The narrator's parents had been experienced campers, familiar with the dangers of the wild, but the bear encounter had changed their perspective on camping forever. For the narrator, hearing this story as a child and later as an adult shaped his own view of the wilderness and camping. Growing up, he was told about the beauty and freedom of camping, how it connected people to nature, allowed them to experience the world in its purest form. But after hearing about the bear encounter and experiencing the unease of the woods himself as a child, he couldn't help but develop a deep sense of caution and fear when it came to spending nights in the wilderness. As he reflected on his own experiences and the stories his parents shared, the narrator realized that the dangers of the wild weren't always physical. Sometimes it was the psychological toll of isolation, the fear of the unknown, and the unease of being surrounded by so much unpredictable nature. He found himself less enamored with the idea of camping as an adult. The bear story, along with the various legends and his own discomfort in the woods, made him cautious about venturing into isolated places for fun or leisure. Even the experiences of being alone in the wilderness, whether it was the fear of getting lost, encountering dangerous wildlife, or simply the eerie sensation of being watched, left him with a sense of respect for the dangers that could lurk just beyond the trees. While many people saw camping as a way to relax and reconnect with nature, the narrator couldn't shake the feeling that those same woods held dangers that were always just beneath the surface. He couldn't help but think that perhaps the stories of the bear, the spirits of the woods, and his own unsettling experiences were all reminders that the wilderness was a place where the line between safety and danger could blur in an instant. While some may have seen it as an opportunity to test their limits, the narrator had learned from both his parents' story and his own experiences that nature had its own rules, and not all of them were meant to be broken.